Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the forum at St. Bart's. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here. If you're joining us in person or joining us online, we're so glad that you are with us for this series in which each Sunday we have sacred conversations about the things that matter. Today we are honored to be joined by the Reverend Natasha Reed-Rice, who is also our guest preacher at the 9 and 11 o'clock services today. She serves as Minister for Public Life at All Saints, Atlanta, Georgia, and she's also the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for Habitat for Humanity International. And since she's a friend and former colleague of our own, the Reverend Zach Nien, I'm going to let him do the more extensive introduction.
Well, Natasha, it is a joy to...
Mike.
Total user error here. It is...
And then it doesn't want to hang.
All right. It is a joy to be welcoming you really back to New York City. And you began your career in law at the Paul Weiss firm, not far from here. In addition to serving at All Saints Atlanta, you previously served the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church, the Church of Martin Luther King Jr. You have quite the pedigree, a graduate of both Harvard College and Harvard Law. Ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Natasha completed seminary at Eden Seminary in St. Louis. So brings a wealth of experience and wisdom and knowledge to share with us today. And we're so glad you could join us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, the topic you've chosen to speak on this morning is prophetic imagination in a New York state of mind, quoting the classic song by Billy Joel. So I thought we would begin with a bit more tame prayer based on hymn number 359 by Dennis Wortman. Let us pray. God of the prophets, bless us as their heirs. Anoint us prophets. Teach us thine intent. To human need our quickened hearts awake. Fill us with power, make our lips eloquent. For righteousness that shall all evil break. Amen.
Amen. Powerful.
Amen.
Well, thank you for having me. Truly, it's wonderful just personally to reconnect with you in person, but also to be in this very special and sacred space with all of you, to meet another group of folk that are trying to figure out what does it mean to live this life of faith in this here and now moment. One of the things I find so important is that when we approach our faith life and our rituals, you know, our liturgy, our prayers, even the Bible, is the insistent faith of the importance of having an insistent faith where we're saying, the Word of God is active and alive. Something in this mix has to make me more alive. Connect with who I am, where we are in this moment. And when we are able to find that together, it's like a treasure hunt sometimes. It really, I think, not only enlivens us, but allows us to be life in the world. And so the conversation on prophetic imagination in a New York state of mind is very much a conversation I think that we can have that brings us to that nexus point of where we find life. In the midst of the hurry, in the midst of the busy, in the midst of the to-do lists, right? In the midst of our obligations to career, to family, to church, to community, to friends, which can drain, what fills our cup? That's where the conversation, I think, joins. I will say the lawyer in me has to make one correction, and it's not to Zach's point. I didn't complete seminary at Eden. I began and became, while there, very intrigued with the writings of Walter Brueggemann. So to kick off this conversation, I'd love to start with a quote by Walter Brueggemann to really kind of get our mind centered on the conversation of prophetic imagination, because that sounds grand. And I bet many of you are saying you're not prophets. Anybody? So I want to provide this as a background for us to begin thinking, and I know that there's several folks perhaps online as well, begin thinking about what it means to be a prophet. And realize that mantle falls on each of us. Let's listen in. So Walter Brueggemann says, I think a prophet as understood in the Old Testament, is someone that tries to articulate the world as though God were really active in the world. And that means, on the one hand, to identify those parts of the world order that are contradictory to God. But on the other hand, it means to talk about the will and the purpose that God has for the world that will indeed come to fruition, even in circumstances that we can't imagine. And then to talk with confidence that even in the midst of all of that, God is working out an alternative world of well-being and justice and peace and security in spite of the contradictions. So and when Zach and I were talking about our conversation today, I told him I want to share a little bit about kind of, for lack of a better term, a revelation that the Lord gave me while toiling day in and day out in the offices of Paul Weiss. Not only was I at Paul Weiss, I was in their real estate group. So I worked on many deals that helped to build buildings like many of those surrounding here, right? And so I was on one late night, and I was tired. I was like, oh my gosh, this is truly a rat race. I feel like I'm being condemned to run to and fro, right? We know, like in the book of Job, he talks about that was Satan's, that was the devil's punishment, to run to and fro. And I was like, Lord, I don't want to live that punishment. Like, there's got to be a way to find a little more balance in the to and fro-ness of this life, right? In New York, we see that amplified more than probably any other city in the country. And so I'm sitting on the 22nd floor, looking out of the window, feeling drained, feeling tired. My cup was depleted, and yet I still had obligations. I still had people I was responsible to, community I was responsible to, closing checklists that I was responsible for, right? And I was like, why is it that I feel so drained? And so I look out the window, and all I saw was concrete. All I see, when you look at for certain vantage points, when you look out of a window in New York City, more times than not, unless you have the wonderful benefit of being near Central Park or Union Square Park, right? And on the island of Manhattan, when you look out of a window, you see building upon building upon building. And I thought to myself, having done many deals with very egotistical real estate developers.
We've never met anyone like that.
I just let that one walk around for a minute. I mean, I'm not lying, am I? And it occurred to me, I said, no wonder their egos are huge. Because when you look out of a window, all you see is man-made. So in that moment, it occurred to me that I was in a place that had more man-made reality in some ways than God-made. And that's when it struck me that that was the contradiction, right? That contradictory awareness that, wait a second, it looks like everything here is man-made. I mean, you have to legislate the number of trees per block to ensure that you have them. I don't know of that in any other city that I've been in, right? And so it just really made me think about, where is God in all of this? And how intentional we have to be when living in this moment to seek God all the more. That is a prophetic determination. And that requires a prophetic imagination. So that as we go through all of this, we don't neglect the very core of our being, which is our soul. Because when you sometimes realize, you sometimes don't realize what is hurting you the most, what is the most weary about you, it's your soul. And when your soul is weary, no amount of sleep can quench that. So how do we, in the midst of this, find rest for our souls? There's a wonderful allegory of a journalist was following nomadic tribes throughout southern Africa. And the nomadic tribes were on the move. Destination to destination, destination to destination. And as the reporter is following them, they pause under a tree. And she says, well, what are you doing? And he says, oh, even though we're nomadic, we must pause to allow our souls to catch up. In the midst of this life, where have you paused? When do you pause? And how do you pause to allow your soul to catch up? So that's the framing I'd like us to just commune with in the next few minutes.
Absolutely. And if you have any feedback or questions as we go along, please do feel free in the room to fill out a card and hand it to my colleague Manny. Or if you're online, you can post in the comments on YouTube and Facebook, or email my colleague Peter Thompson at pthompson@stbarts.org. But I'm wondering, Natasha, short of moving out to the suburbs, where do we begin? How do we begin to cultivate a kind of prophetic imagination in our everyday, urban, often to and fro lives?
Yeah.
What does that look like for you, and what encouragement might you have for the rest of us?
So the phrase that I'll introduce to answer that question is creating a sanctuary in the midst of life. What does that look like? So in what I'm saying, I left New York for different reasons, but I will tell you, when I had that revelatory moment, I was like, I got to get out of here. But God said also to me in that moment, if you leave, and if we all leave, who are agents of God's presence and ministry, then we are doing exactly what we're not to do, right? Because we still need to be alive in the world. We still need to bring a witness to this world in the spaces that we are in, right? So I shared with Zach and Michael yesterday, when I was at my point and brink of leaving, the Lord brought a woman to me on the train on my commute. I had an hour-and-a-half commute into the city one way every day. And she was sitting next to me on the train, and in that moment she turned to me and she said, I know you want to leave where you are, but the Lord has put you there because you're with hurting people that need a place and a person to pray with. That changed my whole perspective. I was like, oh wait, I'm suffering through all this to and fro, not for me, but because you want me here for someone else. And my whole perspective shifted. So creating a sanctuary in the midst of life can look as simple as, I'm not encouraging you proselytizing everyone you pass on the street, because everyone else will just tell you, don't you belong in Times Square? What I am suggesting is that you create spaces for breathing, for prayer perhaps, places where you can sit still, where others can come to you, and that can be in your office. And what I did in my office, even at Paul Weiss, and they don't know this, if anyone's listening, they'll now know, I had an altar, and my altar was simply a reminder of God. So it was a rock I had on my desk. That became my sanctuary in the midst of all of that, where every time I looked upon that rock, I was reminded of God, right? The sanctuary in the midst of life might look like you're doing, and some of you probably already practice this, so I'd love to hear from you, but you may be doing a devotion on your commute in. The sound becomes like white noise at a certain point, I'm sure for those of you who are used to the New York noise. And that becomes you're stealing away some time to have some Sabbath space. It may look like your weekends. You actually take hikes through Central Park. I mean, the walking was my sanity during COVID, right? It may look like a conversation that you set up between you and one of your closest friends where you can discuss and share your heart's and soul's desire. And say, you know, Diane and I, every Wednesday, we're going to take 15 to 30 minutes together. And that's our lunch break. But being intentional about your need, your soul's need for that sanctuary in the midst of life is something that will begin to shift your focus and perspective on why you might be in the certain predicament, situations, and circumstances that we're in.
That's beautiful. I'm also conscious and aware that an accomplished woman such as yourself, you know, you haven't gotten to where you are in life by accident. What is the relationship between a prophetic imagination and our own human ambition?
And so how do we reconcile that, right? How do we reconcile ultimately that, as we heard in the gospel text in a way today, is that our focus should not be on profit, P-R-O-F-I-T, but should be on prophet, P-R-O-P-H-E-T, right? How do we continue, and it takes effort. It takes, and one of the themes that comes out of today's conversation is the intentionality of our walk in the midst, right? So how do we begin to understand our why? I think that's what helps me to usher in the difference between seeking profit with an F and seeking profit with a PH, right? Is that I have to understand my why. So my why And I'm more hard-headed and stubborn than you all, but I've hit many walls in life that have reminded me that that's not where God called you or created you to go. He called you and created you to go this direction. It's kind of like that one of the experiences I had, as I mentioned about the woman on the train. Like, you want to leave, because every human aspect of my being wanted to leave at that time. Not because the place was horrible, but because I just didn't feel like I could sustain, right? And so that perspective shift was part of that. The other part was just in the ambition, understanding that even as I achieve, being very disciplined, and I don't always get this right, but that what I'm achieving and where I am is not only for me. Right, so Moses went into the halls of Pharaoh's house. He didn't know at the time that that's why he was there, but clearly while there, he learned how to talk to Pharaoh. He learned Pharaoh's strategies. He learned how to get to a point where when he left and came back, he was able to negotiate with power, with strength, and speaking rightly. It is not lost on me that I had the opportunity to go to Harvard twice, to be in rooms that other people can't be in. And I realize I'm not there only for me. So my ambition over time has expanded greatly from my personal profit with an F to a communal understanding that even in those spaces, I'm called to stand and bear witness of truth, of what love looks like in public, which is justice, of being that voice for people who don't have the opportunity to sit in the same chair. And one shorthand I use for it is, when you're in those spaces, take up space. That's how justice happens. Take up your space. I mentioned in the sermon that, King said, in the end, we don't remember the words of our enemies, but we remember the silence of our friends. I mean, we know in this moment, if we're honest with ourselves, because having prophetic imagination requires honesty, I believe, because you can't call out the contradictions without that honesty. So there is a contradiction when you say we live in the land of the free and the home of the brave, and there's a good number of people who don't feel that freedom because of the color of their skin, because of their gender, because of the side of the tracks they grew up on, right? So there's a contradiction there. That's just with the American ideal. Don't let me go into the God-called ideal, right? Because God said, love the Lord your God, all your heart, mind, and soul. Love your neighbor as yourself. I always love the third commandment in the 13th chapter of John, where he says, and love your neighbor as I have loved you. And only then shall you be called my disciple. Like, that command links to the intentionality of our walk in faith. And so we have to really evaluate ourselves, our soul space, our intentions, and be honest about how our being and presence can impact the lives of others. So if you look around and you start asking yourself, what are my points of privilege? Is it your skin color? Is it your bank account? Is it your access? Is it your influence? Is it being a part of a community like this? And that then begins to feed into our imagination of what could we possibly do with this influence and privilege together? What conversations could we shift? So let's talk, if I could get more practical with it.
Please.
So when we talk about justice, let's get practical. Housing. I hear you all had some conversations on that topic.
We have. Last week, Mark Levine, president of the Manhattan Borough, was with us and got a barrage of questions about housing here in New York at all levels. It's something that is on our minds as, after the pandemic. Prices have gone right back up to where they were before the pandemic and are climbing. A real lack of affordable housing. Mark spoke about the possibility of converting a lot of these office buildings around us into residential, as they've done downtown. But that takes an awful lot of imagination because it's hard to reconfigure office buildings into housing, and especially difficult to imagine what affordable housing would look like in former office buildings. So yes, we've been talking about housing and would love to hear from you.
Yeah. So when you apply a prophetic imagination to that conversation, right, about housing, one of the things we often do is we identify all of the challenges. I mean, and we've got to do a needs assessment. That's a needs assessment. It's a natural part of any strategy development process. So when we look at that, I mean, I will say as we think about what can we do and how creative can we be, when I practiced law in New York, and are any of you real estate attorneys, real estate practitioners? Okay, 'cause you can correct me, but one of the things I always remembered was, and I thought this was so strange, if there is creativity in housing and real estate and commercial development and housing development, this is the place that develops it. I never understood the concept of selling air rights until I practiced real estate in New York.
Also a big part of our story here at St.
Right.
Bart's.
I mean, right? So if we can figure that out, we can figure out how to convert an office building to residential housing. I just love that's what a prophetic imagination does. It's not fully idyllic and without any concrete strategy. It requires some strategy. Right? It says hope in and of itself isn't enough. Hope has to have a strategy, right? And it's the same type of thing. So if we've done that before, with the expertise and the intellect and the creative minds that we have in this city, we can figure this out. So it's important to identify what was identified in the conversation, right? So my space is affordable housing. Affordable housing and New York City is an oxymoron. I mean, think about that. And yet, we have folks that are figuring it out, right? So when I was practicing law here, the affordable housing kind of work I did were a lot of HUD-related homes, senior housing, and then 80-20 housing. I mean, structures that you obviously still need to garner the funding for, but ways that we try to figure that out. So looking at housing and how we create dignified space for folks that have a different income stream, and seeing folks that have a different income stream as equal to us is where we must begin. We can go through and break out and talk about all the tax incentives and all the layering that we have to do to finance those projects, but the prophetic imagination begins first and foremost with realizing that people who look different than us, who sound different than us, who have different income streams are our equals. And that sounds simple, but it's actually revolutionary in our context. It's very radical, because what we tend to do when we have money is we come in and dictate the solution. So when we're trying to figure out these solutions, the folks that would be a part of that solution are those that will also live in those units. They need to be at our tables. They need to be at the table engaging in the conversations about how we shift, change, and create solutions that benefit them and ultimately benefit us all, right? So the conversation I know that you had as well was what we experience obviously in the housing space when we talk affordable housing, and we typically don't even use that term in marketing circles anymore. It's called housing affordability, is we get into the fear state and we get into the NIMBYism state, right? Those people in our spaces. And that shuts the conversation down rather than, and that's why I think that it's so important to have these conversations in Christian circles, because we have a command, not a suggestion, a command to love our neighbors as ourselves. And that command calls forth community. When you say the Lord's Prayer, what is the first word? Our. The God we serve is a God of neighboring, a God of community. And how we act that out through strategy, through funding, through putting our treasure, time, talent, and tenth, I will say, I call all of those your treasure, into a pot that creates and pushes with passion and purpose a solution forward for a very difficult situation. That to me is bringing life. And is prophetic imagination coupled with prophetic determination that changes the world. And as John wrote in the book of Revelations, so that we might see a new heaven and a new earth. we can go into the technicalities of it. You can tell me all the pros and cons. We can write the budget. But if we do not enter into it with the mindset and the soul set that is required of us as God's children, we short shrift any solution that comes forth. That's where prophetic imagination enters in and begins to reshape our world in the physical.
Wow, amen. I want to get to some questions from our audience in person and online, but first I just wanted to say, I so appreciate your bivocational professional ministry, Natasha, as both pastor and, working in the DEI space currently with Habitat for Humanity, because I think it models the multi-vocationality that we all share. I mean, we all have, many of us have jobs, we have familial functions as parents, siblings, and so forth. We have roles out in the community, roles at church, many hats that we wear. And I think that you demonstrate for all of us a kind of integrated discipleship. The old evangelist said, either he's Lord of all or not at all, right?
Yeah.
So I'm curious, what have you learned from your kind of professional bivocational ministry just about being a disciple and a person of faith, and how might that apply to any of us who may only have one job but many different roles?
Well, thank you for elevating that in that way, and also thank you for calling out the fact that we all have a multi-vocational life, whether we acknowledge it as such. Mine tends to be more explicit. So I began preaching my first year of law school. Not the most common thing at Harvard Law. But I will say very warmly embraced by most of my peers in a beautiful way. And that began the trek. It first began with me saying, Lord, can I do one? And I never got the okay to do just one of those vocations. And so what I initially, as I walked in that space, realized is that for me, I've only understood justice in the context of faith and faith in the context of justice. They're not separated. You need them, they work together. Like I really do not believe you can have justice without a faith context that does what I've suggested already, that it commands you to love, right? And nor can you have a full experience of a life of faith without justice as a goal, as a North Star, because that truly is what love looks like in public. And the faith we live is a faith that is built on LOVE. So how does that work? How do you, it'd be very honest and human about it. It's exhausting. It keeps me in prayer because I never feel like I figure it all out. On some days, those of you who are wearing multiple hats, you feel like you get C's across the board, possibly F's, and in other days you feel like you might have gotten that thing right or that thing right. And it keeps you humble. Like if ever you needed something in your life to keep you humble, live a bivocational or multivocational life. Because you can never get straight A's every day. So one, it keeps me in prayer. And if I'm honest, it's Paul says pray without ceasing. I think people probably catch me talking to myself because I'm probably like, okay, Lord, I need you just this one more time, and I catch myself doing it, whether I'm driving to the next location or flying or whatever. It's right. It keeps you humble. The other thing that it does is it keeps you sharp, because you're constantly having to be ready, as the gospel text talks about today, to be alert. And to find some of the most exciting components of being bivocational or multivocational is when the dots connect, when they collide, right? So even for me, one of my dot connecting moments was going to Habitat, because it's a Christian housing ministry, serves all, serves all, run by all faiths, and yet it's driven by an ethos that is calling us to put God's love into action by building hope, homes, and community, right? That kind of thing. So that was a very wonderful nexus point for me, but that doesn't always happen. It didn't happen when I was at Paul Weiss necessarily. And then I had to figure out ways to nurture both of those calls. So for those of you in multivocational spaces, it is that it's daunting. It does require us to go down that list and say, okay, what am I to say no to so that I can say yes to what God is calling me to. It also, in many instances for me, forces integrity in both sides, because you don't have the time to go back and catch up and to feed whatever lie may have been told, right? Whatever is contradictory to integrity. You don't have the time. You got to be who you are in every situation. Like the tree in Psalm 1, the tree planted on the side of the waters, the winds are going to constantly blow. But if your roots are down deep, when those winds blow, you don't get blown over, because you're the same person in every situation.
Amen. And I think I experience that with you, because I feel like you're always preaching in a good way and feeding my soul. So thank you, Peter. What are folks asking?
All right, the first is just a comment. Some of us find the city enlivening, not exhausting. We love the biblical image of heaven as a city, the Jerusalem above.
I love that, and I think, and that's and I think that's a beautiful statement, because it is full of life, and it is enlivening. But there are moments, I think, which is what I shared, where it gets exhausting. So then, how do you get back to the enlivening part? For some folks. For those that it always enlivens, I think that's awesome. Like, I do have friends that come and visit me and say, I can't sleep without traffic noise out of my window. Like, that's just normal for them, right? And so I am sharing it from a perspective of someone who grew up in Atlanta and Miami and came north. So how you enter into that space. Whereas coming to Atlanta, Miami for a New Yorker who's enlivened by New York would be horrible. And then they're looking for how you find God and all of that grass and trees and
someone asks, in your sermon you talked about tithing privilege, and if you can expand upon what you mean by that.
So I touched on it just a little bit earlier in this conversation, probably may have triggered the question. But when we think about what it means to tithe, it's our sacrificial offering, right? And we oftentimes shorthand it to treasure. We give 10%, and then what's above that offering. I mean, I'll never be in a church and say don't give, right? So that and tithing your privilege. Sometimes your privilege, that is your influence. That is your position that you may hold. That may be your status. It may be your access points. And the way you tithe that is you begin to become more sacrificial in those spaces, speaking up on behalf of another, speaking up for issues or that affect communities, right, or cities. So we talked about housing briefly, right? In a room and beginning to introduce housing as a need and as a human right in a space where housing never elevated, right? If maybe you're at a policy-making table. This is one of the first times in my lifetime where housing has gotten on many policy agendas, right? How do we keep pushing that forward? That's part of tithing your privilege if you're in those spaces. Perhaps you're in spaces where folks are trying to figure out best ways to invest, right, and fund. Think about expanding beyond the default investments, the default foundations where you've always invested, where you've always given. Think about how that treasure, that in your influential voice, tithing your privilege in that moment, how that treasure could be directed to a community, to a people that it had not been directed to before.
I'll share two questions at once. I think they have something to do with one another. The first one is simply, what is going on in Georgia? And the second one is, as we learn to exercise prophetic imagination, what are your thoughts on how to deal with false prophets? Example, Georgia's 14th congressional district.
Oh my. Is
They're just going for
on
it.
there from Georgia? Oh my goodness, that's awesome. Oh my God, whoever asked this question, they have a lot of knowledge about what's happening in my dear state. And so when I give this answer, they're gonna be like, that's a cop-out. You know what's going on in Georgia? A whole bunch of hope. I hope this person doesn't win, and I hope this person does win. I think what we're seeing in Georgia, especially after the last election, where we were a state that was clearly red that flipped blue, and since and I'm glad this question was asked, because I didn't touch on it initially, but the prophetic imagination has to be able to see a country that is not so divided and partisanized. We have allowed this country, I'm going to come back to the question in a second, but we've allowed our country, we've allowed the conversation and the dialogue to partisanize issues that, in my very humble opinion, should not be partisanized. Housing should not be a partisan issue. It's a human issue. How we educate our children should not be a partisan issue. It's a human issue. We have allowed the very divided conversation, political conversation, to even impact the way we worship and to impact the witness that we have as children of God in the world. Right? We've seen study after study, the Brookings Institution study, the Pew study on religion, show that one of the reasons we are in the midst of the most unaffiliated, unchurched generation in the history of this country, one of the top reasons given is the hijacking of religion by politics. And so the way in which we, as God's children, need to begin to maneuver and perhaps tithe our privilege is to departisanize issues that shouldn't be partisanized. And that's hard work. That may be harder than figuring out how to convert commercial space to residential, right? But in Georgia, what we're seeing is that convergence. We've got, there's many things that could be said about Georgia, and I'm not going to specifically talk about the 14th. But we are on the brink of making the decision as a state and as a people about what matters to us and what's important. And many of us are doing this all around the country. Whether it's abortion rights, whether it's issues of gun rights and gun law, I think we are often, many folks are at this point of conversation that's not looking at the impact that those conversations and those policies have on some of the most vulnerable, on the most marginalized. And as children who follow a Jesus that left the 99 to find the one, it is our call to be focused on the marginalized, on the one who didn't get in the crowd, on the one who's suffering because they don't have access to health care, on the one who is plagued by the pre-existing conditions of the pre-existing conditions that led to the horrible fallout from COVID. And so as we talk about what's going on in Georgia, there's a lot going on there that I don't like and that others don't like, and that's my personal bias. But there is a lot going on where we're working to garner and channel that hope that I made reference to into actual action and votes.
I'm reminded of Brueggemann's definition of prophet, in which he kind of encourages us to get beyond a sort of binary, stereotypical thinking of prophets are either kind of spiritual, mystical fortune tellers, and lots of times conservative religion leans into that notion, but they're not also merely social protesters, kind of angry and unimaginative, detached from the spiritual life and community, but the prophetic imagination seeks to bring a holistic sense of what prophecy and the prophetic is in our world. And I'm struck that I know that in your work with Habitat for Humanity, you work with a lot of conservative evangelical churches. You also work with a lot of liberal churches and organizations and folks working in the community, and you work with folks of many different faiths. So I'm wondering if you've found any hope in the work that you're doing, or wisdom around what it might look like to come together across the lines that divide us and foster a collective prophetic imagination.
Yeah, I love that. That's a beautiful question. I definitely find hopeful moments in the work that I do. I mean, that's a big part of what feeds me as well as what exhausts me sometimes, because we do bringing together diverse voices, opinions, approaches is an idealistic call, and it's a call that I think we're all actually called to, but it's also not easy work. It can be very challenging. It requires us to not take personal offense so quickly. It requires us to listen in ways that we had not listened. And it requires us to find ways to express the understanding of our truths in a way that allows space for others to do the same. So I will say, and I clearly probably have already revealed my political leaning, but I'm not doing it in a way to ostracize others. Some of my closest friends in the Habitat network have a very different political persuasion than I do. And that gives me great hope, because we are brought together for the values and the vision and the mission of what we do together. By building, by creating space for people who would otherwise not have that opportunity for a housing solution. One great way that the Habitat model does it is the literal building together, right, on a job site. But we can replicate that type of building together in other settings that don't have to be Habitat related. And when we do that and realize, I'm trying to figure out how to caulk this line straight, just like you might be, and all of a sudden we begin sharing our struggles and our challenges, and we connect on a point that's very neutral versus our different polarized views, we all of a sudden have a coming together. Getting to that point requires all of those difficult steps that I mentioned at the beginning, but when you hit that reward, it just opens the world and the light in ways that you hadn't seen. So how we do that, I think, and the church is primed for that type of work, right? Because even doing the work in Habitat in the space of equity, I begin that work with a statement of our why. Why do we do this? We do it because we have an amazing, radical, compassionate history in the founding of our organization. We cling to the gospel belief that we are here to put God's love into action. And with those powerful values, that history, we can begin to infuse those who lean all the way to the left and those who lean all the way to the right, and encourage a gathering and a communion. That's what communion should be, right? Communion should be the moment where all of God's children gather around the table to partake in that moment. When we still look at our churches and how divided they are racially, we must ask the question, are we really having true communion? So perhaps the prophetic imagination begins to see even our communion tables differently, and the act of what that means, and that breaking of bread and drinking of the wine as blood begins to look like. As we re-enter and think about the history, we have a compelling history. St. Bart's has a compelling history of justice building. It stands on the solid foundation of a Christian faith that has been tried and true. With those values compelling our why, what does it look like to break bread together? So that's where the prophetic imagination and determination take us. I mean, clearly there's breaking of bread and drinking of wine in this space. What a wonderful way that you all have found to engage people who otherwise would not enter into the sanctuary. So as even thinking about, and I'm sure you're already far along on this pathway, imagining the fellowshipping in a way that we hadn't imagined. And I think that's what we're being pushed to do coming through this COVID moment.
So unfortunately, we have to end it there, but it's not over. If you weren't at our 9 o'clock service, you can hear Natasha preach at 11 o'clock, so we hope you'll stick around, whether you're in person or online, and join us for worship at 11 o'clock. We also hope you'll join us next week. We'll be welcoming the founder and executive director of a nonprofit called Wellville, philanthropist and investor Esther Dyson. We'll be talking about the initiatives she's leading to create equitable well-being in 5 communities around the country. So this kind of conversation will continue next week, and we'll continue at the 11 o'clock service as Natasha preaches. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great.